screwdriver and do it now, but I've got tightened the top. No, it's not. It's the bottom. It's a matter of flipping it over. I'm guessing that you can pop the caps and do it. Trying to let people get here because we're running slow tonight. Started here. I know people will wander in late, but we'll be taking prayer requests, and we can pray for them if we need to. Anyone to remember in our prayer time? Anyone to remember in our prayer time? Mandy's sister-in-law who's facing cancer. Keep Max, our newest hoper, in your prayers. If you saw the email, Max was thinking he was having reaction to the elevation here and went to the doctor, and it turns out he's got some masses on his lungs and his liver that are pretty serious. And so they're waiting to have it biopsied and waiting to figure out what it is. So we don't know what it is. And his parents flew out immediately on Sunday, and they have decided, since they're having trouble getting to get things biopsied, they're going to go ahead. They went ahead and flew home this afternoon. So he's no longer went back to Illinois where he lives, and where he's hopefully going to be able to get to the doctors there quicker and take care of him, and then get treated so he can get back here where his plan is eventually to be here. But again, we don't know what's going on, so please keep Max in your prayers, and his family too. His dad's driving back right now, and that's the other piece of it. So Max has flown back with his mom this evening, and his dad is driving Max's vehicle back. So driving across Kansas, let me just put it that way. He definitely needs our prayers. My wife one time jokingly said, maybe we should move to Kansas someday. And have you ever been there? Some people love Kansas, I know, but I'm not some people. Yes, sir. We'll start Bible class. We're going to take some prayer requests, and then we're going to sing one song, and we're going to have prayer and sing one song, and then we'll go to Bible class. Sound fun? And the youth get to stay here because Jimmy's teaching. So that's the plan. That's right. Will gets to stay here. Pray for my wife as well. She found out Monday she has COVID, and so she's doing better. She got a cold and was coughing real hard and everything, and thought, I better check myself before I go to work on Monday. And turns out she turned out positive. And I've been testing every morning before I come in. Don't worry. As of 6 this morning, I was clean. So if I've got it, I picked it up during the day. So, yes, that's what we've been doing. We do not. We picked ours up at Walmart. So. Okay, yeah, I know we got a few free ones in the mail a while back, so they are available. You can get them I know King Soopers has them too, so you can get them if you're worried. But she's feeling a lot better. She was real tired. She still has her sense of taste and her spunk. I was hoping she'd lose a little. Oh, well. She's not watching this, I'm afraid. I'm hoping not. Sorry, Nina. Anybody else to remember in our prayer time? Did anyone hear about how I know Gail Pentola had some tests? Anyone hear how she did, how things are going?
Blood tests are good, but she has another CAT scan in 3 weeks. Talked to him today.
Elbert, anyone heard recently from Elbert? I have not.
I think he's home. He had the surgery, right?
Yes, I think he is. That's all I heard.
Don, I saw Don at supper there. He talked to him today. He was at the house.
Okay.
He said he looked better last week than this week. He's busy today.
Okay. Anyone else? Anything else? Yes, sir, Max.
Can we pray that if COVID goes away, let's hope for the people who have COVID, make sure they get better.
Mm-hmm. I hate to say that is good news, because doctor's visits sometimes take a long time, and I'm glad you can't fix it if you don't get to the doctor. So, anything else? Anyone else? Let's pray together then. Heavenly Father, thank you. Thank you for this evening to be together, to share together, to laugh and joke around with each other, to study your word and share concerns. We lift up Max to you right now, that you would take care of him, be with him so that he can get the help he needs, that they can figure out what's happening with his body. We thank you that we was able to find out what was wrong, but at the same time, we ask you to just be with him and give him peace now as he's waiting. Be with his parents too, as this is as moms and dads, many of us understand and know it's so scary when we see our kids hurting, when we love them and we're worried about them. So I ask you to bless them and be with him. Watch over his dad as he's traveling, that he'd stay alert and get home soon. Ask your blessings on my wife, Lord. Take care of her. Watch over her health. Be with her as she feels better and feels a little stir crazy too. Bless her and be with her, that she can to get through this. We do pray for the rest of the world and so many others around us that are battling COVID. We just ask you to help take it away from our world and take it away from us, that it would no longer be a concern. We thank you for our health and for protecting us, but ask you to continue to watch over so many that are struggling with it. Be with Gail. Thank you that her blood test went so well. We continue to watch over her and help her as she continues on. Likewise with Elbert, thank you that he's home. Help him to recoup quickly and to get better soon. For Jerry, thank you. Thank you for getting him to the visits, the MRI, and the things he's got going on. But comfort him, help him to be patient in the meantime as he's waiting for them to schedule all the different things that he needs done. We do thank you for your comfort and peace that you give us through all we do. We thank you for your guidance and your presence in our lives. Help us to pay more attention to that and acknowledge you more. Guide our study tonight. Be with Jimmy as he talks with the adults, and me as I do stuff with the younger kids. Bless us in all we do, that you would be glorified and that each of us would grow closer to you. We thank you and pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. When we walk with the Lord in the light of his word, what a glory he sheds on our way. While we do his good will, he abides with us still, and with all who will trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and obey. All right, kids, let's go to Bible class.
Youth group staying in here tonight. Sorry that you're stuck with all these old people again. Actually, I don't see very many. Oh, they're at the back. There's some youth group folks. Again, I appreciate your patience and flexibility as things are, we're kind of week to week on a variety of things. So we're going to do hopefully, I don't know if you'll be able to see the verses I put up on the TV or not. We spent a while in Daryl's office today we were wrestling projectors, trying to figure out if we could get my laptop to talk to the projector, and Bruce was standing there laughing at us. I was like, I don't know, hunched over trying to get some cord out, and I made some grunting noise, and he was like, "Are you okay?" And I was like, "Yeah, I don't know why. I guess I'm that old that when I bend in weird ways, I make noises. So next time somebody asks me how old I am, I'm going to say, well, when I stand up and sit down, I make weird noises. That's how many years old I am." So it's weird, when you realize you're at a new stage of life in those moments. But before I get started, other order of business. So back, I guess it was late last summer, the youth group ordered T-shirts and hoodies, and Aaron Spong designed a cool logo for us, and we sold them to the youth group at a little bit below what we paid for them. And we ordered a few extra, thinking a few others might eventually want to buy some, but that didn't happen. I even kept offering them great deals. We were selling the hoodies for $20, and so I eventually told them they could get 2 hoodies for $40. Or if they were really nice to me, I'd let them get 3 hoodies for $60, but nobody took me up on that. So I'm going to make, now that it's been almost a year, so I'm going to make the executive decision that we're just going to give the rest of them away. So Kaylee, can you hold up one of the T-shirts so people can see it? I think I have one of every size, basically, of the T-shirt. Well, not every. It's like small, medium, large, and I might have an extra large. And then hold up one of the hoodies. The hoodies, they just say Longmont YG for youth group on the front, as you'll see. And then on the back is that same logo. And they're really soft, comfortable hoodies. And it's free advertising for our church if you just go out and wear that. So if you're interested in a hoodie or a T-shirt, we have, 4 or 5 of each there, maybe 3 or 4 of each. So feel free. Okay, so continuing what we were doing last week. Again, I'm just kind of using the same stuff I was using for the youth group and adapting it for this audience. So I'm using this book called Around the Bible in 80 Days, which is kind of a devotional book that looks at the big picture story of the Bible, just pulling out little snippets here and there to paint a bigger picture. It's by a guy named John Mark Hicks. He is, last I heard, he was a professor at Lipscomb. That's all I really know about him, but it's good stuff here. We talked about, I'm just going to give a quick 1-minute overview of everything we talked about last time. So he calls it a theodrama in the sense that it's a story, a narrative that's about God. And so I'm really trying to emphasize that, because so often, I probably said this last week, so often when I'm reading, I want the takeaway of what am I supposed to do? And so it ends up being centered on me instead of centered on God. And so the deliberate approach here is to ask who is God? What is God doing? Et cetera, because it's his story. And we talked about kind of 5 parts. And you could, of course, break down scripture in a bunch of different ways. But the way he's breaking it down here is Act 1, creation, Act 2, Israel, Act 3, the Messiah, Act 4, the church, and Act 5, the new creation. So I'm just going to give some highlights here. I think we started here last time. So the idea of God's creation going from empty and void to very good, that we were made in the image of God. So we talked a little bit about what does it mean to really see myself as made in the image of God? What does it mean for me to really see others as made in the image of God? And we talked about the idea of a temple, that God's creation is like his temple, and we are his image within that temple. And then I think we ended here with this idea of wisdom and folly. And I was kind of rushed on this one at the end of class last week, so I wanted to revisit it just for a second. This idea of these 2 trees in the garden as representing wisdom and folly. And even that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, we can see that almost as maybe God's ultimate goal for his people to get there, but they had to get there the right way. He wanted his creation. He wanted us to know and discern wisely between good and evil just as he does, but shortcutting it is folly, right? And that's what happened with the fruit. And I was thinking about this morning, actually. So Bruce and I went out for a run in the morning in the rain, and we were talking about, I guess, just youth and the mistakes we all make when we're young, right? And it brought to mind when I was in college. We would have papers to write frequently, and I and all my friends, for most of our time in college, would terribly procrastinate on these. So, it's like a 10-page paper you have to write, or a 20-page paper, and we're waiting till like the night before, which is a bad idea, right? And so I vividly remember nights where we would, we goofed off for all the weeks up to this point, and it's like, okay, now it's due tomorrow. So we'd grab a stack of books from the library, we'd go to some little room in our dormitory and sit there making all our notes and typing up some terrible paper at 4:30 in the morning or whatever it was. And we did this and did this and did this. And then one time I just realized, this is miserable. Like, why am I doing this to myself? And I was like, I'm going to try the other way. And so on the next paper I wrote, and some of you probably figured out this way faster than I did, but the next paper I wrote, I was like, okay, I'm going to, like, a couple weeks before start working on this. And I just did a little bit every day. And then by the end of, by the day before, I was just last couple of proofreading things. And I turned it in, and I was like, that was way easier. It was so much less work and less stress, and it was just better, and it was a better product at the end. And I was thinking about that and how that, in a way, and what's funny about that is I've tried to tell students that, like, when I was teaching high school in Texas, I've tried to tell students that, but for some reason it doesn't, like, land. Like, sometimes you have to experience things before you can get there. And I don't know, that just made me think of this concept of God's wisdom, that he's bringing us along slowly based on what we can handle. And we keep trying to take shortcuts, right? We keep trying to jump to the end, and that's just folly, right? That's the same dilemma of Adam and Eve in the garden. Are they going to take the hard way and the right way and walk with God and learn from God and listen to God and eventually arrive at wisdom? Or are they going to listen to the serpent and try to take an easy shortcut to get there? That's such an interesting reflection of every day for us, right? And how this is like the human condition. Am I going to build on sand or rock, right, as Jesus said? Anyway, so that's just a kind of a thought about what we talked about last week. So let's move on. So our next text, and for those of you who weren't here, each kind of little snippet here is a short couple of verses, or a long one in this case, and then just a couple of questions, and then we move on, and we're trying to use those to paint this kind of bird's eye view of the story of the Bible. So Genesis 3, 1 through 7. You know what? That's not the one I want. I want this one. Here we go. Genesis 4, 3 through 7. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel, for his part, brought the firstlings of his flock, their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. The Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it." Okay, so, up to this point, let's think about the situation in the stories we looked at last week. So, sin has entered the world. Death lies ahead for everybody in the story, except for Enoch, but pretty much everybody in the story. It seems like humanity has hit rock bottom here, but there's actually more to the picture and more coming. Some things worse than death, right? Because sin is worse than death. It's interesting. The word sin is not actually used to describe what happened in the garden in that story. I think it's reasonable to describe it that way, but it's interesting that this story is where the word sin first shows up. When God confronts Cain about his anger and where that anger is going to lead him, That's when the word sin shows up. And it's really an interesting phrase that sin is lurking at the door, right? That's such a vivid description. And it hits home for me, right? Maybe it does for you too. Just the idea of sin as almost like a predator stalking its prey, right? That it's just right there, ready to pounce. I'm picturing like a tiger, right, in the tall grass, just ready to leap. And when sin overpowers us, what happens is we fail in our task. Remember from last week, our task is to be the image of God and to fill the earth with his glory. And so when sin masters us, we can't do that anymore. So Cain moved from anger to violence because sin mastered him, which is later what Jesus warns us about in Matthew 5, right? When he says, don't be angry because this is what's going to happen. Now, despite all of this, hope still remains in the story. Humanity wasn't completely abandoned to sin. God's grace is still in play here. So I guess what I want to ask with this story is, can you think of other examples of this kind of progression where we go from anger then to actual sin? Or maybe other stories come to mind, or maybe examples from modern life. Can you think of, I guess what I'm trying to tease out here is this idea of sin lurking. Can you think of other examples where something happens in your heart and then it leads to something else? Yeah. Saul and David. Saul, you think about his story, and there's such interesting descriptions of what happens to Saul, because at one point it says that the Lord sends a demon to torment him, and I've never been quite sure what to do with that, if that literally means that God sent a demon to torment him, or if it's more like figurative of, because Saul starts out and he kind of resents David, but he's letting him play music for him, and then he eventually tries to kill him, and then you can see that, like you're saying, that progression, it gets more and more serious throughout the story. Other ideas of where we see anger, leading to sin, either in Scripture or in life today, I don't know. Oh, yeah. Instead of obeying God, he kind of decides, no, I'm going to do this my way. Trying to think of a modern example that we encounter frequently. Maybe, I guess, like road rage, right? That leads people to do crazy things. And I've never done anything, but I've definitely felt that, like, something goes wrong on the road and it makes you really angry. What bothers me is being like a drive-through line or something, and somebody will cut in front of me, and I'm like, it's like as if it's this great injustice, right? And it's this huge problem, and I want to like fix it and say something, and then I realize that's really stupid, and this doesn't matter at all, right? But it's funny how something as trivial as that can trigger something in your heart that would lead you down a really ugly path.
I don't know the whole story, but recently in the news there was something about two neighbors were fighting over a dog or something.
Huh.
Having an argument, one of them ended up killing the other.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Just over a dog doing something.
It's crazy how often, and it's sad, how often we hear stories like that in the news where something trivial or fairly insignificant in the grand scheme of things happens, and somebody ends up hurt or killed because of this progression from anger to violence. A minute ago I said that God's grace remains here. Where do you see grace and mercy in the story of Cain and Abel? Yeah, he leaves him there, right? And he's exiled, so there are some consequences for what he did. He's sent out east, right, and all that. But he's not immediately, dead, right? Let's move on to kind of the next step here in Genesis 6. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. So it's interesting to me. It's not surprising. So I mentioned this book is by a Lipscomb professor named John Mark Hicks. I know he's written a lot on violence and nonviolence in the Bible, and I think he feels pretty strongly about the ethic of nonviolence. So it's not surprising to me that's kind of the lens here. But it does say that, right, in this verse. The corruption is that violence filled the earth. That's an interesting way to think about sin. God saw that the earth was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted its ways upon the earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. Now I'm going to destroy them along with the earth. So, when Cain is exiled, he's afraid. It's violence leads to more violence. And he commits violence, and now he knows somebody's going to get me. And that's what happens, is the violence propagates, right, throughout the earth. Lamech, I think right after that story, boasts about a young man who, it's unclear, depending on the translation, insulted him or hurt him or something, and then he kills him. And he imagines his fame as greater than Cain's. So it's like violence is just increasing. It's just snowballing until creation is just saturated with this corrupt violence. And God is, I think, horrified at what we had done with the beauty of his creation, what we had turned it into. And so then the flood comes. And I've always found it interesting. You look at some of a lot of ancient cultures from the Near East have flood stories, which is not surprising. But it's interesting how they explain it and how it's different. So for example, I've always thought it was funny. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, there's a flood narrative. But in that one, the gods flood the earth because the people are too noisy and the gods can't get any rest. It's interesting that compared to this deeply profound moral, dilemma in the Bible. Anyway, I'm not really making a point with that. I just think it's funny. So, the world is just spinning out of control. And so God decides, no, I need to reboot this whole thing, right? And so still, despite what happened, goodness and grace and mercy remain. Even in the midst of this judgment, God's patience is long and deep, and justice is weighed with mercy and how God responds to this. He didn't entirely annihilate creation. He's instead renewing it. And then in chapter 9, he issues a warning. He says, whoever sheds blood, their blood is at risk as well. So this idea of you keep down this path of violence and corruption, and it's going to come back to bite you. Kind of like Jesus said something similar in Matthew 26. Whoever lives by the sword dies by the sword, right? So think about, I want to kind of ask the same question. Maybe the answer is obvious, but I want to ask the same question I asked for the last story. When you think about the story of Noah and the flood, and I'm gonna direct this one to the youth group in the back there. When you guys think about the story of Noah and the flood, can you think of where do you see grace and hope in the midst of this terrible story of the earth being flooded and all these people being sinful and dying? Can anybody identify where's some grace in that story? Go ahead.
I said the rainbow.
The rainbow, okay.
I know it's
God's
at the end,
beauty
but
in his creation. Sorry, go ahead. What?
I said, I know it's at the end, but a lot more
Yeah.
people survived than everyone else thought when they were
Yeah.
injured.
I hadn't ever thought about it. I'm not sure if this is what you meant, but it never occurred to me when you think about like population growth that the number of people that died in the flood is just a tiny fraction of the total people that lived after that, right? So there is a lot of mercy just in that concept, right? Of look at all the good that maybe came from that by God, lancing the boil right there, right? What else? Anybody else in the back there, youth group? Where do you see grace in the story of Noah? I'm going to have to call on somebody maybe. Let's go with Faven. So the question is, where do you see grace in the story of Noah?
Well, like JC said, like his family and him survived,
Yeah,
and like all the animals.
right. And God didn't have to do it that way. He could have done it some other way. And I wonder if there's a lesson in that when we think about our world. I mean, it's pretty easy to look around at our world and lose hope and feel like it's spinning out of control and full of corruption. And I don't know, when I think, you could look at the story here and just focus on all the wrath and judgment, but there's grace and there's hope in it, and there's grace and hope for our world today too. God is still at work in the midst of whatever's going on, right? And I think it's really important for us to hold on to that grace and hope with whatever's going on in our lives and whatever's going on in the world around us. Okay, and then at the end of kind of this section here, we get kind of almost an interlude, a kind of a separate kind of story that we're all familiar with. Chapter 11, verses 2 through 4. They migrated from the east. They came upon a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. They said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks, burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone, bitumen for mortar, and they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we shall be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." So I think God is a realist when it comes to humanity. I think he knew that the flood wasn't going to cure the problem. He knows that sin is entrenched in our hearts, and it doesn't take long after the flood in the story here for sin to show up again, right? We see this prideful empire, building, we think some kind of ziggurat. There are a bunch of ancient ziggurats throughout like this part of the world. This is one of the famous ones in modern Iraq, though my understanding is that what you see in the photo there, a lot of that is later reconstruction of the original. We are talking about several thousand years ago, right? So, but you could imagine something like that as being what's at play here in this story, some kind of ziggurat, because they built those over there for, throughout, as far back as Babylonian history goes. There are examples of ziggurats. And some of those stones, you probably can't see it in the picture, but there's some up here that are clearly older than the rest. And I think some of the foundation stones, too, are thought to be, original to way back when. So in my notes here, Babylon, which namesake Babel, right, like in the story, featured a massive ziggurat dedicated to the god Marduk. Others were built throughout the millennia after that. God's words, think about God's words when he starts to create. He says, "Let us make humankind in our own image." But then Babel says, "Let us make a name for ourselves." So again, we see this. God has a purpose, and we go a different way with it. So humanity moved from violence in the last couple of stories we looked at now to idolatry. Now they want to be worshipped, right? So it progressed from, destroying fellow images of God to now substituting themselves for God. And again, I kind of want to think about this in terms of our own hearts, that we're in the same position where we might not build a ziggurat, right? But we tend to make that same move in all sorts of ways, I think. Whether it's individually or just people today, right? Societies today. But again, in the midst of this story, hope and mercy remain. God's grace is still at play. God's mission is still going. The story's not yet finished. 2 questions here. One, what build today? Whether it's on an individual level or something on a bigger scale. What towers of Babel do we try to construct for ourselves? I realize it's a little bit of an abstract question, so it might take a second to think through. Sure, yeah, let's go with that. It could be either way, but yeah, let's start with individually. How do people do the same thing? If I look at my personal successes, my career, right, and I'm building my identity on that. That's a path to the same place that they're headed, right? Sports, right? And that's true of professional athletes all the way down to like high school athletes, right? In the sense that I taught kids back at Fort Worth Christian who, I love these kids. They're great kids, but you could tell that they had built their entire sense of identity of who they were on how they performed on the football field. And that's cool that they could do that, but how small is that compared to what God wants for them? How small is this big tower compared to what God wanted for them, right? Or I knew kids who, you can even take really good things. Well, not to say that athletics are a bad thing, but like I knew kids who were so obsessed with grades that their entire sense of who they were was shattered if they got a 97 instead of 100 on a test. And it's like, something's out of whack here. If that's, you know what I mean? Something's not quite lined up. We're trying to build something for ourselves that's not leading us where we want to go. And yet, isn't God's grace still, go ahead, sorry. Okay, so like, yeah, phones makes me think of like social media, especially with the younger crowd. I don't use Instagram, but I get the impression, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, I get the impression that there are a lot of people who the face that they put on Instagram is really important to them. And it's not the real face. It's not really who they are, but they want people to see that and think that's who they are. That's interesting, right? Or you said money, right? That could be a Tower of Babel that we construct for ourselves. Yeah. But God's grace is still evident in the midst of this story and in the midst of all those stories, that he's not given up on us, right? Okay, so moving on to Act 2, Israel. So the promise to Abraham in Genesis 12. Now, yeah, go ahead.
Before you get there, just thinking about that situation that God
Mm-hmm.
the people by confusing their languages.
Yeah.
And when you travel around the world, you just wonder how did people come up with all these different religions?
Yeah.
And I have the feeling that when he spread these people out, they knew very little of him. And as time went on, they knew less and less and less. And then when you get the story of Israel, he's trying to reteach the people.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't feel like I have a good grasp on what did even Cain and Abel like know about God. I mean, they clearly they were doing they knew to make some kind of offering, and one was better than the other, though it doesn't exactly clarify why. That's interesting, does it? In Hebrews. Okay, yeah. Yeah, something in his heart, something in the intentions maybe. But like, okay, so, the next generation, what did they know about God? And what was passed on down through Noah, I would assume through Noah's family, right? Things are passed on. But like you're saying, by the time you get post-Tower of Babel, I don't know. I mean, I think there's more. I personally believe God is doing more than we see in this picture. Because like later in Genesis, this priest of God, Melchizedek, shows up. And it's like, where did he come from, right? How is there's no priests yet. That's not till like Leviticus, right? So where's this priest? So God is up to stuff, I think. And we don't always see the full picture, right? In fact, we will really never see the full picture in this life. So yeah, anyway. Okay. Genesis 12. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you, make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. The one who curses you, I will curse. And in you, or some translations through you, all families of the earth shall be blessed. And then later in the chapter, the Lord appeared to Abraham and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So, whereas Babel determined to make its own name great, God decides to make Abraham's name great. It kind of illustrates the two paths people can choose, right? Are we going to choose ambition and pride? Or are we going to choose God's promise, God's grace, and do things his way? Way back at the start, we talked about why did God even create this? And the thought is, well, to bring us into communion with him, to share his love with us. He could have given up on that plan, but he doesn't. He renews his mission again through Abraham. After all these people seem to have, forgot who he was, and like we were just talking about, maybe it doesn't get passed down through the generations. He promises to redeem them instead of annihilate them. He promises to multiply Abraham's descendants, give them a land to inhabit. And I always think it's important to mention the seventh promise there. It wasn't just about Abraham. The goal was all families on earth. He's just starting with Abraham. And God's promise didn't really have any conditions other than go. It's go, and I'll do this, 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 and this, right? It's just this promise God makes. He promises Abraham gifts. Abraham believes him, and then God remains faithful to those promises. And God's faithfulness is the whole rest of the story, right? The rest of the story of the Bible is God's faithfulness to these promises. Let me throw that out to you. How is this promise to Abraham still being fulfilled today? Any thoughts on that? We're sitting here, yeah? Yeah. 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 And if we're right that God's purpose is to share his love with us and to bring us into communion with him, then, that's playing out every day, right? All over the world. And God's faithfulness to Abraham, I think, is encouraging. Abraham's not perfect. He makes some dumb mistakes in the story. But God was faithful to him. And thousands of years later, God is still being faithful to Abraham. He's still fulfilling his end of the deal now. 4,000 years later or something, right? God is today still being faithful to that promise. So, just think about what does that mean for you and for me, that's how faithful God is. That when he says something, that's how committed he is to it.
You see that all through the prophets when God is condemning them because they're worshiping idols.
Yeah.
I'm not going to kill you all just because of the promise I made to Abraham.
Yeah.
And he says it over and over.
Right. And then he makes, other promises like the promise to David to establish his throne, right? And then these kings are so terrible and just keep doing all the wrong things, and yet you keep seeing God's grace. You keep seeing God being faithful all throughout that. And that's an encouragement, right, when we think about our own stories, we think about our own journeys and the mistakes we've made and the ups and downs and the detours, right, to think about God as this steadfast, unchanging God. A word I always try to talk about as often as I can with the youth group, and I'm sure I've mentioned it in sermons. I think it's the most important word in the Old Testament, is the Hebrew word chesed. And it's always fun to say because it's that weird back of your throat sound that we don't really have in English, but chesed, it's something like between a K and an H, whatever that, in the back of your throat. But it's translated loving kindness or steadfast love or faithful love. I think it's God's defining attribute if you read the New Testament, and it's just all throughout the Old Testament, this idea of God just being faithful all the time in his love and never changing in his love. Okay, let's move on so we're jumping way ahead now to Israel as a new humanity. God also spoke to Moses and said to him, I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob as God Almighty, but by my name, the Lord, I did not make myself known to them. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land in which they resided as aliens. I have also heard the groaning of the Israelites, whom the Egyptians are holding as slaves. I have remembered my covenant. Say therefore to the Israelites, I am the Lord, and I will free you from the burdens of the Egyptians, deliver you from slavery to them. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm, and with mighty acts of judgment. I will take you as my people, and I will be your God. You shall know that I am the Lord your God, who has freed you from the burdens of the Egyptians. I will bring you into the land that I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I will give it to you for a possession. I am the Lord. Okay, so God continues his creative purposes. He creates Israel, essentially, in the story of Exodus. They go from the moral and the moral chaos of Egypt, and the oppressiveness of that situation of slavery, now to a new start, right? And the story of the Red Sea is just full of creation language, of he's separating the water, right, and creating a space for them to pass through. Just as humanity was supposed to be the image of God in the garden, now Israel is going to be the image of God in the world, right? He gives them the Torah to guide them in this new life. But they kept repeating this same folly, the same one that we do too, of trying to take those shortcuts and not doing it God's way. And I'm going to skip ahead now because I want to get to this one. Exodus 19. Then Moses went up to God. The Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, tell the Israelites, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings, brought you out to myself. Now therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. These are the words you shall speak to the Israelites." So Israel meets God on Mount Sinai. They encounter him on Mount Sinai, and he gives them this new job, this new commission as a royal priest among the nations. And it came with the responsibility of, now you're supposed to embody the life of God, the values of God in your own communities and in the world around you. And I want to get, let's see, somebody who's in the youth group back there that has a Bible. I need a volunteer to read one verse for me. Isaiah 49:6. Raise your hand if you're in the youth group and you've got a Bible and you're willing to read one verse for us. Anybody? Phoebe, thanks. Okay, so this verse Phoebe's about to read is sometimes called the Great Commission of the Old Testament. You know the Great Commission in Matthew, right? Go into all the world, making disciples, et cetera, et cetera. This is like the Great Commission of the Old Testament. So it's Isaiah 49:6. Go ahead whenever you find it. 49:6.
He says, "It is too small a thing for you to be my servant, to restore the tribes of Jacob and bring back those of Israel I have kept. I will also make you a light for the Gentiles, that my salvation may reach to the ends of the earth."
It's too small a thing, he says, for you to just be my people. What does that mean? What do you do with that? How do you understand that? Why is it small? For when he says, you could just be my people, but that's too small a thing. Yeah, there's something better. He says, go be a light to the world. What are some ways that we can do that? What are some ways that we today can be a light shining in darkness? That's a pretty open-ended question. Go with that wherever you want. But what do you think? What's something that today we can do? Let's start. I want to hear from different age groups. So let's start with somebody in middle school, 6th, 7th, or 8th grade. Tell me how you can be a light in the darkness, Kaylee. Okay. Okay. Being kind and over and over. So the idea of just relentless kindness. Just keep doing it. Maybe it'll rub off. Yeah. How about somebody in high school? What's the way that we can, right there.
Sharing and being generous.
Okay. Generosity, sharing. I like it. How about somebody that's like in the young adult age? Go ahead, Hannah.
I guess just not living what is trendy and what is
Yeah.
good and pure and, holy to the best of your ability.
Yeah, so trendiness versus holiness. I like that comparison, right? Trendy is to do what everybody's doing. Holy is literally to be set apart. So that's a good answer. How about somebody in whatever you consider the next age group? This is going to get awkward in a minute. I'm going to get myself into trouble. Somebody that's an adult that's working. I don't know. Somebody younger than Bruce. I had to sneak it in there. Yeah, Jason.
I think all three of the responses included one of the fruits of the Spirit. And I think
Yeah.
that encompasses everything.
Yeah. So by displaying the fruits of the Spirit, maybe displaying is the wrong verb there, but by, I don't know, growing or embodying the fruits of the Spirit in our lives, we're shining a light. I like that. Right? Because, I mean, and the metaphor of fruit, right? This is what God is producing in us, is love, joy, peace, patience, etc. Somebody else? Yeah.
I think you have to be able to meet people where they're at
Okay, so we can...
to truly do that.
So you can tell me if this is not what you meant, but what I'm hearing is like shine a light by showing mercy and grace and not expecting people to meet all of my standards, but by accepting where they are right now. Kind of like Jesus did when he shows up to the tax collector, the prostitute, or whatever, and his first move is grace. That's step one, is he shows them some kindness, right? Yeah. Is that kind of what you meant? Okay. Anybody else? How do we shine a light in the darkness?
I think mentoring.
Yeah.
Mentoring even in the church or even outside of the church.
Yeah.
Mentoring someone, bringing them along.
Yeah. We've probably all known people who have done that for us. And it's always encouraging to me when I see people deliberately doing that. Like I know some of you deliberately seek out individuals to kind of, and you work at it to bring them along. And that's just really cool and I think a really godly thing. What else? I saw, oh yeah.
I don't always know how to do this, but somehow we need that all these things that we're doing, people need to know we're doing it because of Christ. Okay. So everything we do in the name of Christ. Yeah. And so somehow that message has to get across. And we're not just nice people. We're nice because of Christ.
So some kind of transparency about our motivation, right? That I'm not just being weirdly kind, but I'm doing it because of a specific reason, right?
That's logic and humanitarian.
Right,
I
yeah.
saw a quote from Humanist that's saying we're good without God.
Okay. Huh. Yeah.
So they say they're doing all the things we do, but they don't have to have God to do it.
Right. Of course, I guess our counter to that would be that all those good things you're doing are actually because of God, right? Like the common grace of
They just
everything.
don't know it.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. I think Bruce had a hand and then back there.
Looking back in history over all these years, seeing other people at other ages and stages going through the good, the bad, and the ugly, I think it gives us, we can give them a sense of understanding and encouragement and less criticism.
Yeah.
And maybe even some guidance if they're willing to listen and follow it. But I think the thought is just understanding we can say, yep, did that, got the t-shirt, wore it out,
Yeah.
and now this is where I'm at. And it's just an appreciation for people going through those different stages of life.
I think what you're saying kind of builds on what Randy was saying, this idea of passing on your experiences to others, and yeah. And then, yeah, go ahead, right there.
Well, I have two things. You
Okay.
could share how God has helped you in your life with other people, or you could show kindness to someone who's not very kind towards
Okay.
you.
Yeah, I like that. Showing kindness. I like the second part of that. To someone who's not very kind. That's a biblical idea, right? It's easy to be kind to people who are kind to me. I think most people do that, right? If somebody's nice to you, the natural thing is to be nice to them. But what sets I think the teachings of Jesus apart from that is showing kindness even to the opposite, right? JC?
When you watch a sport, it's more fun to watch it because people are enjoying it more. The people that are playing enjoy it more.
Uh-huh.